The first thing I heard through the static of a long-distance satellite call was the sickening, metallic shriek of a bolt cutter biting into hardened steel, and I knew right then that Bethany Vance had finally lost her mind. My sister Chloe's face appeared on my screen a second later, her hands shaking so hard the camera was just a blur of gray morning light and suburban driveway. But the audio was crystal clear. I could hear Bethany's heavy, labored breathing and the clatter of a heavy chain hitting the pavement. There she was, the self-appointed queen of Oak Creek Estates, standing there in a floral bathrobe that looked like it was struggling for its life, clutching a pair of industrial cutters while a tow truck idled behind her like a scavenger waiting for a carcass. The tow driver was actually leaning out his window, looking nervous, telling her in quote, "Lady, I'm telling you, that bumper has federal plates," in quote, but Bethany just waved him off with this terrifying, manic grin, shouting about, in quote, "community aesthetics," in quote, and in quote, "unauthorized, oversized vehicles," in quote, as if she were reciting Holy Scripture. She had no idea that by snapping that lock, she hadn't just removed a, in quote, nuisance, in quote, from her sight. She'd effectively tripped a silent wire that was currently sending a high-priority alert to a task force hub 3 states away, and honestly, if I wasn't in oppos, so furious, I might have actually felt bad for the tidal wave that was about to hit her. You see, I've spent the last decade working as a specialized field agent for a multi-agency federal task force, which basically means my life is a cycle of 6-month deployments, cheap coffee, and carrying equipment that the government is very, very protective of. When my grandmother passed away and left me her craftsman-style bungalow in Oak Creek, I thought it was a blessing, a place for Chloe to stay while she finished grad school and a home base for me when I wasn't in oppos. Tea in the bush. But Oak Creek came with a hidden tax, and her name was Bethany Vance, a woman who carried her HOA presidency like it was a Roman consulship and treated the neighborhood bylaws like the 10 Commandments, except she was the one holding the stone tablets and the chisel. She was one of those people who seemed to exist solely to measure things. The height of your fescue grass, the exact shade of beige on your shutters, the number of minutes your trash can sat on the curb after pickup. And she did it all with this huffing, puffed-up sense of indignation, as if your existence was a personal affront to her property value. The trouble started the moment I parked my service vehicle in the driveway before my last deployment. It's a modified, heavy-duty black SUV, unmarked but clearly in quote, government in quote, and that way only certain vehicles are, with reinforced bumpers and a specialized encrypted comms array bolted to the roof. To a normal person, it looks like a rugged truck. To Bethany, it was and quote, commercial eyesore, end quote. That violated Article 4, Section 2 of her precious handbook. I'd barely been on the ground in my deployment zone for 72 hours when the first email hit my inbox, typed in all caps, dripping with that specific brand of suburban venom, informing me that, in quote, industrial machinery, in quote, was prohibited and that I was being fined $500 a day until it was removed. I tried to be professional. I really did, having Chloe send over my official orders and a letter from my supervisor explaining that the vehicle was required to be in my primary residence for rapid response protocols, but Bethany didn't in oppos. Care about federal mandates. She cornered Chloe at the mailbox one afternoon, looming over her with his smug, narrow-eyed look, and told her, in quote, "Your brother might think he's a hero out there, but in Oak Creek, he's just another resident who can't follow the rules, and if you can't end oppos, control his assets, perhaps this ISN and oppos, the and oppos, lifestyle and oppos, for your family," end quote. That word, in quote, lifestyle, end quote, it was her favorite dog whistle, a way of saying she didn't in oppos, T1, end quote, are kind, end quote. They're meaning people who didn't in oppos, spend their weekends obsessing over mulch. But it got darker than just emails and fines because Bethany started realizing that with me thousands of miles away, she had a captive audience in my sister. Chloe started calling me, crying, saying she'd wake up at 2 in the morning to see a flashlight beam dancing across the living room walls. And when she'd look out the window, she'd see Bethany's wide silhouette waddling around the SUV, pressing her face against the tinted glass, trying to peer inside at the gear. Our internal security logs, because of course a federal vehicle has 360-degree night vision surveillance, showed Bethany coming onto the property 17 times in a single week, sometimes just standing there for 20 minutes, whispering into a cell phone, pointing at the antenna array like she discovered a spy nest. She was obsessed, convinced that I was running some kind of, in quote, dangerous operation, in quote, out of a quiet cul-de-sac. And her husband, Mark, who sat on the local planning commission, was right there behind her, feeding her ego and telling her she was, in quote, protecting the borders, in quote, of their little kingdom. The harassment turned into a coordinated campaign. Suddenly, our mail was being, in quote, misdelivered, in quote, to the HOA office. Chloe's tires were found slashed with a note tucked under the wiper that said, in quote, move out, in quote, and neighbors who used to be friendly started crossing the street when they saw her coming. Bethany had poisoned the well, telling the neighborhood watch that the black SUV was a, and quote, magnet for criminal elements, in quote, and that the, and quote, unstable military types, in quote, living in grandma's house were a threat to the children. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, and it was working. The community was turning into a pack of wolves, led by a woman in a floral bathrobe who thought she was untouchable because her husband knew the mayor. But what Bethany didn't in Oppos, T realized, was that she wasn't into Oppos. T just messing with a tired soldier. She was messing with a guy whose job it is to find people who dawn into Oppos. T want to be found and document things they dawn into Oppos. T wants seen. I had every single one of her midnight excursions recorded in 4K resolution, including the time she tried to jam a screwdriver into the door lock, and I was just waiting for her to cross the one line I knew she couldn't in Oppos. T come back from. That line was crossed on that Tuesday morning when she showed up with the bolt cutters. C. The vehicle was and Oppos. T just parked. It was secured with a heavy-duty, reinforced federal security chain anchored to a steel bollard I'd installed in the concrete. It's standard protocol for high-risk equipment. When Bethany snapped that chain, she didn't in Oppos. T just, in quote, tow a car, in quote. She committed a felony theft of government property, and more importantly, she breached a secure container holding encrypted communication hardware. The moment the tension on that chain snapped, an automated silent alarm went out to the regional marshals in Oppos. Office and my own task force lead, flagged as a, in quote, level 1 asset compromise, in quote, while Bethany was standing there, chest heaving with the effort of her, in quote, victory, in quote, laughing as the tow truck driver hooked up the front axle. A fleet of black sedans was already screaming toward Oak Creek from 3 different directions. Chloe stayed on the line with me, hiding behind the curtains, narrating the whole thing as the scene turned from a suburban squabble into a full-blown federal raid. Within 15 minutes, before the tow truck could even pull out of the driveway, the street was blocked off by sirens that didn't end Oppos. T sound like local police. I watched through the SUV's remote feed as Bethany's face went from smug triumph to absolute, bone-white terror. She tried to play the, in quote, I'm the president, in quote, card, waving her clipboard at a man in a tactical vest who looked like he hadn't into Oppos. T smiled since the 90s, screaming about her bylaws and her rights as a property owner. The agent didn't in Oppos to even speak to her at first. He just walked up to the tow driver, showed a badge that made the guy's jaw drop, and said, in quote, drop the hook and step away from the vehicle, or you're going to spend the next decade in a cell you can in Oppos. T walk out of, in quote, Bethany, God bless her stupidity, actually tried to step between the agent and the truck, shouting, in quote, this is my jurisdiction. I have a court order for this removal, end quote. The agent just looked at her, stone-faced, and said, in quote, mind Oppos, you just use a pair of bolt cutters to breach a federal security perimeter. You aren't in Oppos. T in charge of anything anymore, end quote. The fallout was like watching a house of cards get hit by a leaf blower. Once the federal investigators started digging into why an HOA president felt empowered to attack a government vehicle, they didn't end Oppos. T just stop at the bolt cutters. They got a warrant for the HOA's financial records, and what they found was a gold mine of corruption that would make a mob boss blush. It turns out Bethany and her husband had been treating the HOA bank account like their personal slush fund for years, diverting over $200,000 in quote, maintenance fees, in quote, into Mart Construction Company for, in quote, consulting services, in quote. That never happened. They'd been systematically targeting families they didn't and Oppos. T like mostly military, younger couples, or anyone who dared to question a line item on the budget, and hitting them with fake violations until those families were forced to sell their homes at a loss, often to buyers who were secretly affiliated with Mark's business. It was a classic and quote, squeeze and flip and quote, scheme, all hidden behind the boring, mundane curtain of neighborhood rules and aesthetic standards. The day of the emergency community meeting was the most satisfying moment of my life, even watching it through a video link from a tent in the middle of nowhere. The neighborhood center was packed, and the atmosphere was electric with a mix of fury and relief. Bethany was there, but she wasn't into oppos. T wearing her bathrobe this time. She was in a cheap suit, her hair a mess, looking smaller and more haggard than I'd ever seen her. Her husband sat next to her, staring at his shoes, while a federal prosecutor stood at the podium and laid out the entire conspiracy in cold, hard numbers. When they played the footage from my SUV's cameras, the night vision clips of Bethany sniffing around the windows like a stray dog, and the clear, high-def audio of her telling the tow driver she'd, in quote, take the heat, in quote, for the, in quote, illegal, in quote, truck, the room just erupted. People she'd bullied for years, elderly women she'd fined for having the wrong flower pots, veterans she'd called, in quote, unstable, in quote. They all stood up, one by one, and told their stories. It wasn't an oppos. T just about a truck anymore. It was about the 7 years of psychological warfare she'd waged on a bunch of people who just wanted to live their lives. When the marshals finally stepped forward to read the charges, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was picked up by the microphone on the podium, and I swear, the cheer that went up was louder than any stadium crowd I've ever heard. Bethany didn't end oppos. T go out with dignity. She went out screaming about how everyone was, in quote, ungrateful, in quote, and how the neighborhood wouldn't, quote, rot, in quote, without her protection, while she was led away to a transport van that was a lot less comfortable than the SUV she tried to tow. She ended up taking a plea deal for embezzlement, civil rights violations, and felony interference with government property. 6 years in a federal facility, no parole. Her husband Mark got 4 years for his part in the financial fraud, and their house, the one they'd used as a base to terrorize us, was seized as part of the restitution order to pay back the families they defrauded. Today, Oak Creek is a different world. Chloe is the vice president of a new board, which has a grand total of about 5 rules, most of which involve being a decent neighbor. My SUV still sits in the driveway when I'm home, and nobody says a word about it, except for the kids who want to know what all the antennas do. We turned the empty lot where Bethany used to stage her, in quote, inspections, in quote, into a community garden, and there's a small plaque there dedicated to my grandmother, a woman who actually knew what community meant. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, oppos, T? How many people like Bethany are out there right now, hiding behind a clipboard and a title, convinced that because they own a piece of dirt, they own the people standing on it? We got lucky because I had the backing of the federal government, but most people are just fighting these battles on their own, one, in quote, violation, in quote, notice at a time. So, I have to ask you, have you ever dealt with a, in quote, Bethany, in quote, in your life? Someone who thought they were the law until the real law showed up? And do you think the punishment fit the crime? Or is there a bigger problem with how much power we give these neighborhood kings and queens? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your HOA horror stories. Let's talk about whether these organizations are actually about, in quote, property values, in quote, or just a playground for people who never outgrew being a bully.